This morning we are going to be continuing in our study in the book of Eccesiastes. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 2 of Eccesiastes as we look at Solomon's continued search for the meaning of life and how to find happiness in the world in which we live. The title of my message this morning is The Great Experiment. And after what Solomon talked about in chapter 1, where he looked at life and thought it seemed so empty and meaningless and without purpose, in chapter 2, we're going to be looking at some different ways in which he tried to find happiness, and the results of this attempt, or this great experiment, as he looked at some common pursuits that people follow in searching for happiness. And what I'd like to do is just look at a few verses at a time, read these, and discuss with you what Solomon discovered. So if you look at Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and begin with verses 1 down through verse 3, the first paragraph there. I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is foolish. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. Pleasure. How many people like to feel good? Yeah, it's a very natural human response. Everyone enjoys the sensation of pleasure. And we gain pleasure in many different ways. We have different senses. Our sight, what we can see, the things that we observe. Many people gain a lot of pleasure through visual stimulation. Things like art, movies, scenery when you go out into nature. There are many things that we can gain pleasure through what we observe and simply by what we watch and what we see. Sound, the things that we hear. And of course, music is probably the biggest source of pleasure of the things that we hear. But also the sound of nature. If you go out into the woods, the sound of the wind, walking along the beach and hearing the waves. There are a lot of natural sounds which bring us relaxation and pleasure. Taste. Taste is one pleasure we all enjoy. What we eat, what we drink. Many people find a great deal of pleasure, too much pleasure, through the sense of taste. Smell. The things that we can draw through our nose. And that is very closely connected to taste, scientists tell us. What we smell affects our taste buds. And sometimes scientists can trick people by smelling one thing and tasting something different. There have been some interesting experiments done with that. And of course, smell goes into the natural world as well, enjoying things like flowers, plants, the smell of the woods, the smell of nature through the sea, the salt airs, fresh air. Smell can be a very enjoyable sense of pleasure. We have the sense of touch, the things that we feel, pet, rub our hand on. We get a lot of stimulation through touch. The clothing that you wear, the softness of the fabric, the sheets that you sleep on. There are many different ways that we can get pleasure simply through touch. Massage. Most people like a nice massage. All of these senses can give us pleasure. And in this first few verses, Solomon decided that he would explore this avenue in seeking happiness. And one thing that he talks about was wine as a way of giving pleasure, drinking. And yet, when he tried this approach, he did not find total satisfaction. Now, sometimes when people read Eccesiastes and they read Solomon's comments, they think that he sort of went to extremes. That when he was pursuing pleasure through eating and drinking, that he became a glutton and he became a drunkard. And that is not the case. As Solomon writes, guiding me with my wisdom, keeping my wisdom. And so Solomon did it in a sort of scientific way. He experimented with these things to a degree. He did not completely immerse himself in any of these senses to the point where he lost his ability to reason and to analyze and to evaluate the experience. Sometimes when people eat or drink, they overeat or overdrink, and it affects their mind. They become sleepy, they become tired, they pass out too much drinking. They don't remember what they did. And this was not the case with Solomon. He did not lose control of his ability to think and to reason. As he tried these various ways to find satisfaction, he kept hold of his ability to evaluate and to examine the effects of his endeavor. And as he tried these various sensual ways, he discovered some very key points. First of all, sensual pleasures are not enduring. Now, take for example food. Even food that you really like, you take a bite, you can savor the flavor for a few minutes and then it's gone. And if you want more pleasure, what do you have to do? Take another bite, right? But what happens if you keep eating the same thing for a long time? Can you eat indefinitely? No, right? And some foods, simply you can't tolerate eating indefinitely. For example, spicy foods, hot foods. We have a pizza party once a month. One thing we order is jalapeno. And most people can eat a few pieces, 1 or 2 pieces, and that's usually enough. Because the spice, after you eat 1 or 2 pieces, you can't taste anything else. And eating more doesn't really give you any benefit. Also, if people eat the same thing or drink the same thing again and again and again and again and again, what happens? What is a natural response to that, typically? Do you enjoy eating the same thing every day? 3 times a day? Now, I know Japanese like to eat rice. But even food that you really like, most people get tired of it if they eat the same thing again and again and again. And some people even get sick of something. They develop a dislike for something if they are forced to eat a lot of it at one time or for a long period of time. To the point they can even become physically sick of it simply to look at it in the future. Sensual pleasures are temporary. They are not something that lasts. And we can never be totally satisfied by them. We always need to try to get more, and yet, even when we get more, we become sick of it. We can't take it anymore, and it fails to keep us happy. And in some cases, it can be dangerous. People who become addicted to alcohol or to different kinds of drugs. You know, they start out with a small amount, a small substance can give them a pleasure, can get them high. But after a while, they have to take more and more and more and more to reach the same sensation. And eventually, if they don't learn to control it, the result is death, overdose. That is the natural result of following sensual pleasure to the extreme. Your body overdoses. And there are other problems with these pursuits of sensual pleasure. Sometimes the results of these things are not what we anticipated. The consequences of pursuing sensual gratification, the consequences are not what we thought they would be in the beginning. The law of unintended consequences. For example, if you like to eat a lot of sweets, tastes good while you're eating it, may be great, but there are long-term health consequences if you eat too many sweets and too much sugar. And we see that in Western society and in America. Increases in lifestyle diseases, obesity, diabetes. Consequences that people did not think about when they took those bites. We have an English idiom or cliche, a moment on the lips, a lifetime on the hips. You know, we don't think about that when we're eating. Nobody's thinking, oh, I'm going to gain 10 pounds. I want 5 kilos. But those consequences come down the road. And we know that there are many, many health consequences that come from the way that we treat our body. What we eat and what we drink, how we live. Those things all affect us in the long run. And that is why, as Adventists, we put such a strong emphasis on our health message. That we talk about temperance in what we eat and what we drink and how we live. Because, as the Bible has clearly warned us and promised us, there are good and bad consequences, long-term, that come from how we treat the body that God has given us. And so, the law of unintended consequences is something that we have to consider, and that Solomon discovered as he was pursuing pleasure through his senses. Let's take a look at the next few verses, beginning with verse 4. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired men and women singers and a harem as well, the delights of the heart of man. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all of this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. Yet, when I surveyed all that my hands had done, and what I had tried to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. So Solomon first tried the pursuit of pleasure, gratifying his senses. And next, he decided to accumulate money and possessions. He wanted to be successful. And he was a very intelligent man, a very ambitious man, and he put his hand to many different kinds of projects. And he describes many of the different projects that he undertook. He became a designer, and he designed and commissioned great projects for his kingdom, building palaces, gardens, waterways, aqueducts, public works. Japan spends a lot of money on public works, building dams and roads, and some of them are kind of meaningless. People are like, where does this road go? But Solomon built these monuments to his greatness, pressing the limits of his intellect and his designs, both for their beauty, their symmetry, their utility. He beautified Jerusalem. He beautified his kingdom with his great projects. In all areas, gardening. Now, most people, when they think of gardening, they think of a little vegetable garden. I know Noah and his family have a garden where they grow vegetables and fruit and bring them in for us. We enjoy their contributions. But the gardens that Solomon commissioned were not a small vegetable garden. They were large, elaborate gardens. Japan is famous for its gardens. You can visit them around the country in different cities, Kyoto, Nara. There are very large and beautiful gardens, well kept, manicured, with paths going through them, ponds and rivers and lakes. And Solomon designed these kinds of large, beautiful gardens around the waterways that he created, the pools and aqueducts. Some of them were quite huge. And he built these gardens, and he used them as laboratories for his interest in the plant kingdom. We know from other places in the Bible that Solomon spent a lot of time studying nature. And he used these large gardens as a place to experiment and to study plants and flowers and trees and to observe the interaction, creating little biospheres of different kinds of plants. And Solomon was into other areas of agriculture and husbandry, flocks and herds, raising cattle, sheep, goats, and horses. And Solomon developed a lot of land for that, setting up ranges for his animals, stables. Archaeologists have dug up huge stables that Solomon built for his horses and chariots. And he experimented with animals as well, observing them, crossbreeding them, looking for good, strong stock for his pleasure of his herds. And in addition to these areas, he, as a king, he was a diplomat. He made treaties with neighboring kings and neighboring countries and provinces, made alliances and built up a network of allies around him. He received tribute from many of these provinces and surrounding kingdoms. And at the highest point of his power, the tribute came from as far away as the Euphrates and as far south as the Nile in Egypt from his father-in-law. He was a successful businessman. He entered into partnerships with the king of Tyre and Sidon. They set up joint ventures, building large fleets. The Phoenicians were famous at that time. They were the leading seafaring nation. They had the expertise and the knowledge of sailing and of commerce by sea. And Solomon made an alliance and treaty with them, a business pact. And he provided the wood to build the ships. They provided the sailors, and he provided some men to help serve in these crews. And they launched large trading expeditions around the Mediterranean and even around Africa once a year, or actually once every 2 or 3 years. There was a large trading fleet that would go all the way around Africa, picking up and trading with tribes along the exterior, down to Ethiopia, Somalia, collecting ivory and other exotic materials from the Dark Continent. And so Solomon applied himself to business, and he was successful, as we read. He got lots of money. And we read in Kings that during Solomon's reign, gold became the main currency, the main coin of the realm. Silver was considered cheap. Silver coins were considered common, not so valuable. Gold was considered the standard because so much money came into the kingdom during Solomon's time. And as we read, Solomon had so much money, he could buy anything he wanted. He could have anything he wanted. Any project he wanted, he could spend the money for. Anything that he wanted, he could have. He increased his staff of his palaces. He had many slaves and servants. And he had a large harem, and we know he had 300 wives and 700 concubines. 1,000 women were in his harem. Anything that he wanted, he could have. And yet, when he considered these things, he was dissatisfied. Because just as when we look at the sensual pleasures, when we look at achievement, by nature we are never satisfied by what we have and what we do. God created in us the desire to achieve perfection, to do more than what we have and what we are at now. God is always wanting us to challenge ourselves, to improve ourselves. And so when Solomon accomplished all these things, he was dissatisfied. And we see that in the world today. You have people that are billionaires, and yet, what do? They try to make more money. They have more money than they could possibly ever spend in their life, and yet they want more. They try to start new businesses, to take over other businesses. They're not satisfied with what they have. When you meet people who are successful in a field whether it's writing or art, very few people are happy. It's like, oh, I need to write one more book. Oh, I want to paint something better than what I have already painted. Or, well, yes, I've had a successful album, but, you know, I need to sell more. People are always wanting to get more, to do more, to reach a higher level than where they are at. And so, even when Solomon had achieved all of these things, and in all of these various areas, he realized that he still wanted more, and that he was not happy. He was not content through all of the successes that he had. Continuing, looking at verse 12. Then I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom, and also madness and folly. What more can the king's successor do than what has already been done? I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise man has eyes in his head, while the fool walks in the darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. Then I thought in my heart, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said in my heart, this too is meaningless. For the wise man, like the fool, will not be long remembered. In the days to come, both will be forgotten. Like the fool, the wise man too must die. Solomon turned his attention back to wisdom. And when we talk about wisdom and foolishness, it's pretty clear. It's common sense. Wisdom is better, right? How many people like to be called foolish? Anyone? No. Yeah. It doesn't matter what culture. It doesn't matter where you're from. In no society is foolish considered a great thing. In no culture, in no time in history, has foolishness or stupidity been considered positive. And yet, as Solomon observed the path of the wise and the path of the fool, he realized something. What is the end? What is the final point for the wise and the foolish man? It's the same. Both of them go to the grave. Both of them die. Now, maybe the foolish man dies sooner and quicker. The wise man might live longer. But under the sun, this expression that Solomon uses many, many times, and as we talked about in the beginning, under the sun means on this earth, in this temporal life in which we live. Solomon was not comparing wisdom and foolishness from the point of eternity. He was not looking at it in that light. He was looking at things as how they affect us here. And worldly wisdom. A man who is wise in the eyes of the world and the man who is foolish in the eyes of the world, both of them end up dead. Both of them die in the end. And this, Solomon thought, was not so good. It seemed pointless to him. And we know that when Solomon talks about his exploration of foolishness and of wisdom, it goes far beyond what is written here. Solomon was a wise man. He sought out wisdom. He sought out knowledge in all corners of the world, inviting people to come to his kingdom, to meet and to discuss their culture, their philosophies, their ways of life. Solomon was driven in his desire to learn all that he could. And that extended into areas which proved dangerous to him. His wives worshiped many other gods. And part of his quest for knowledge led him to study and to experiment with these other gods and these other religions. Solomon got himself into a lot of bad things. Idolatry, demon worship, black magic. He got into things that were madness in his search for happiness. And once again, the long-term consequences of this pursuit of these other forbidden areas of knowledge were to hurt him and his family and his kingdom. Because by his example, as he worshipped these other gods, and he built temples to these other gods, and encouraged the worship of these other gods for his wives and concubines, the people followed the king's example. And his example was a primary cause of the growth of idolatry in the kingdom of Israel. And it led him away from the true God for many years. That was not Solomon's intention at the beginning. In the beginning, Solomon thought he would always stay close to God. But as he explored these other paths and he walked into these other philosophies, little by little, he drifted away from God until the gulf was very large. And there are many people like that in the world today. Christians who think, well, you know, I can consider this philosophy, or I can read about this, or I can study that, and it's okay. It's just a scientific, academic exploration. And it won't affect me. I'll be safe. But the Bible tells us that by beholding we become changed. As we expose ourselves to influence, it affects us, consciously and unconsciously. The people that we associate with us, their attitudes, their philosophies, their language, imprints itself on us. And we are slowly affected by their values, by their lifestyle, by their culture, both in positive and negative ways. We need to be careful about the things that we expose ourselves to. Knowledge is good, but not all knowledge needs to be discovered. That goes back to the original temptation in the Garden of Eden, right? Adam and Eve, Satan as a serpent. Oh, eat this fruit and your eyes will be opened. You will know more than what you know now. And it's true, they did learn more, but there was a consequence for that. We need to be careful about the things that we allow ourselves to be exposed to. Let's take a look at the final part here. Beginning with verse 17. So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool? Yet he will have control over all the work into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. For a man may do his work with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then he must leave all he owns to someone who has not worked for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What does a man get for all the toil and anxious striving with which he labors under the sun? All his days, his work is pain and grief. Even at night, his mind does not rest. This too is meaningless. As Solomon reflected on all that he had attempted and all that he had done, he had been very successful. He had built up a great kingdom, a great fortune. He had made all of these great public monuments, temples, palaces, gardens, aqueducts, farms. And yet, he realized that you can't take it with you. When you die, all of those things go to somebody else. All of that work, all of that effort, someone else gets the benefit. In America, we have a very popular bumper sticker. Older people like to put it on their cars. I'm spending my children's inheritance. I can't take it with me, so I'm going to spend it now. I'm not going to leave anything for my kids. That's their problem. I'm going to enjoy what I have. When Solomon got to the end of his life, he realized it was all going to go to somebody else. He had spent all of his career working and building, and he had no time left. He couldn't spend it all. It was impossible. And as he looked at his situation, that made him angry and bitter. Especially because of the person who was going to get it. The crown prince. His oldest son, Rehoboam. Rehoboam was not like his father at all. He was a foolish man. And he was a spoiled guy. Think about it. Your father is the most powerful, the richest person. And he's very busy. And so you are free to pretty much do whatever you want. He was the ultimate spoiled brat. How many of you have met those in your life? The kid, the kid at school who had always the best clothes, all the newest things. Maybe he was really stupid. Often they're very handsome. You know, Solomon was a handsome guy. His wife, I'm sure, was beautiful. So Rehoboam, I'm sure, was, you know, the typical jock, you know, big, strong, handsome. All the girls liked him. And because his father was busy, he got to grow up pretty much however he wanted. I'm sure Solomon gave him tutors and teachers, but, you know, hey, I'm going to be king someday. I don't have to listen to you. You know, if I don't like you, I'll have you fired. I'll get another person. And you know, powerful people, the way that people act around them changes, right? Oh, yes, sir. Sure. What do you want? Oh, how can I make you happy? You know, we have the English expression, yes men. You know, people who, they'll tell you whatever you want to hear because they want to keep you happy. You know, you're rich, you're powerful, you're influential. They don't want to say anything that might make you upset. And Rehoboam, because he was a spoiled kid growing up, he soon was surrounded by these kinds of people. Fools attract fools. You know? Foolish people usually don't like wise advisors. They don't like the counsel they get from them, usually. Wise advisors don't last long around foolish people. History is filled with examples. Nero, one of the worst emperors of Rome, his tutor was a very educated guy. But as Nero grew older and had more control, he pushed him away and finally had him executed. Foolish people don't like to hear wise counsel. And as Solomon looked at his son, Rehoboam, and he saw what kind of man he had turned into, he was doubly frustrated. Because first, he couldn't take all of his accomplishments with him into the grave. And second, he was leaving all of this to this stupid, foolish, arrogant kid who had not listened to him much at all. And Solomon was very distressed by that. He wondered what would happen to all the things that he had built up. How long would it last with such a foolish boy following him to the throne? And beyond that, Solomon also knew that the kingdom would not survive because of his sinful ways. God had prophesied the kingdom would be divided after his death. That part of the kingdom would go to one of his servants, Jeroboam. And Solomon already knew the kingdom would not survive that he had built up. And when he looked at his son, this foolish kid, and when he looked at what he developed and realized most of it would go to someone else, he was very disappointed. And as he considered this, and once again, the phrase, under the sun, in this life, looking at your success in the ways and the eyes of the world. If only looking at this life and the rewards of this life, then this result was terrible. a nightmare in Solomon's view. And as Solomon thought about all that he had done and the burden of work, thinking about it day and night, and in Japan, you know, the land of overtime and overwork, this is very true. I meet many people that work 6 days a week, 7 days a week. Their work is never done, and they never stop thinking about it. It's like, oh, yes, I work until midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. I go home, I sleep 6 hours, I get up, I go to work. Work was a terrible burden and curse, Solomon felt, when we look at the end result. And of course, that was part of the curse that God placed upon Adam. That work would be difficult and hard, and that it would cause him a lot of stress. And as we look at our modern society, for all of our advances, we talk about our society is more developed and we have better technology. Has that freed us from work? Are we working fewer hours? Not really. Not really. You know, we talk about the computer revolution. You know, I have a pocket PC. I can do all kinds of work while I'm walking around or waiting at the bank or sitting on the train. Great power at my fingertips. But I still work the same number of hours. You know? It's not, oh, you have a computer, you only have to work 1 hour today. How many bosses tell you that? Oh, you can use the internet to find what you need in a fraction of the time. Oh, that's okay. 8 hours, you can do more work for us. Technology has made life easier, but it hasn't reduced our work. We are still working as many hours, or more hours, than in the past. And as Solomon looked at these things, and as he looked at how the world views these things, in the eyes of the world, and in the values of the world, it was ultimately depressing. Continue with verse 24. A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too I see is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat and find enjoyment? To the man who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Verse 24 is one of the most famous passages in Eccesiastes. Eat, drink, and be merry. You know? In the eyes of the world, in the values of the world, that's really the best way to go. Live life, enjoy life each day, because in the end, you're going to die. That philosophy is found pounded into our culture. In our music, you know, you listen to popular music and, you know, live fast, live hard, enjoy life while you're young. Because when you're old, you won't be able to smell or taste or do any of these things anymore. You gotta enjoy life every day because you don't know about tomorrow. And if you don't enjoy life every day, you're stupid. And that leads to some pretty foolish behavior. In America, most people do not save very much money. And people love credit cards. And it starts very young. University, junior year, senior year, suddenly all of these envelopes come in the mail with little credit cards in them. Sign here, you have a free card. Wow, money. And many Americans, young Americans, they start spending money before they even get a job. And by the time they graduate, they have so much debt from borrowing money to pay for school and playing with their plastic that they're already slaves. They have debts of 2 or 3 times their earnings for a year. It's going to take them 10 or 20 years to pay that debt off. They have no economic freedom. And most of them don't care. Well, you know, I'll get one credit card and I'll get another one. And I'll use the money from this one to pay for this one. A pyramid scheme. These people, they're living for today and not thinking about the future. They are following this philosophy of, you've got to do it today because you may not be around tomorrow. And if I'm not around, it's not my problem. You know, I can borrow as much money as I want from as many different people who are foolish enough to give it to me. And if I die, well, I finish ahead. And we laugh. But there are many people following that path today. Live life for the day. That is the underlying philosophy of the world. Because there is no future. And as Christians, we know that this is not the case. As Christians, we know that there's something more than today. And even this life. We are preparing ourselves for eternity. And as Paul writes, I am willing to give up all of the treasures of this life. Fame, fortune, the honors of this society. All of these things are temporary. They are not going to last forever. And we are striving for an eternal treasure, an eternal value, an eternal kingdom. Jesus talked about this in the Sermon on the Mount. You know, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world, but to lose his own soul? My kingdom is not of this world, he told his disciples again and again. Don't worry about the things of this life. God will provide what you need. And if you are following God, if you are staying true to His guidelines and His philosophies, then your eternity is assured. And that is a treasure far beyond anything of this life. We can't trade a few baubles of this world for the endless glory and the eternity with which we will have to enjoy all that God has prepared for us. The Bible tells us that we can't begin to imagine what God has in store for us. How can we give up what is unimaginable, what is infinite, for something so finite and limited and temporary as what the world offers today? As Christians, we have to live in this world. But that does not mean we have to become the world. As Christians, we know that God will provide all of our needs, and that we can be content and satisfied with what God provides for us. The Bible has promised us over and over again that God will give us all that we need, and even more than we need for this life. And so, as we live each day, we should prepare for eternity and tell others about what we know, so that they too can join us there someday.
Thank you, Mark. To bring our service to a close,